Everybody from BadEmpanada to Cynical Historian loves to roast Guns, Germs, and Steel. This book gets so much undeserved flack that I figured somebody has to step in to defend it. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow to keep the channel alive. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, Guns, Germs, and Steel is a pop history book from back in 1997 written by Jared Diamond, a biologist and geographer. Now, the whole point of this book is to explain why Europeans specifically and Eurasians generally have been more wealthy and prosperous and powerful in human history than Africans, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, so on. Diamond's overall thesis, which he describes like this at the end of the book, is the striking differences between the long-term histories of peoples of the different continents have been due not to innate differences in the peoples themselves, but to differences in their environments. All human societies contain inventive people. It's just that some environments provide more starting materials and more favorable conditions for utilizing inventions than do other environments. Okay, so we'll get into the specifics soon, but Diamond's whole book is opposed to explanations that just attribute Europe's success to genetic or cultural superiority. So right off the bat, any accusation that Guns, Germs, and Steel is racist, which is a common accusation, is insane. Now, Jared Diamond is not a historian, and he makes mistakes that a regular historian wouldn't make. The videos I'll review from BadEmpanada and Cynical Historian point out some of those mistakes, but I'm going to show how those really don't change the fundamental strength of the overall thesis of the book. Okay, let's first explain Jared Diamond's actual argument, and not the straw man people stuff together, because nobody else really explains it very well. Diamond starts his book in Papua New Guinea way back in 1972. While talking to a local politician named Yali, Yali asked, "Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own?" Now, here's a fun fact. National Geographic made a documentary of this, and here's how they decide to shoot this question.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
Okay, in case you don't get it, cargo is material goods, technology, so on, i.e., why was Papua New Guinea colonized by Britain and not the other way around? And the same question applies for actually much of the entire planet. Why did Eurasians, especially Europeans, conquer and colonize so much of the world and not the other way around? Well, Diamond rejects any sort of genetic explanation, which I also debunked in another video. He also rejects the environmental explanations that managing rivers or cold climates were the sole major stimulator for civilization. Now, there is some merit to those arguments, but whatever. Next, Diamond identifies the direct factors that enabled Europe's conquest of other continents: guns, infectious diseases, steel tools, and manufactured products. Well, that's it, right? Roll credits? No, the question is why European societies had those things and Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians did not. And the key, he says, is food production, i.e. farming. And not just any farming, but good, strong, viable farming. Now, why did Europe have superior farming and food production? Well, as he summarizes on page 407, because 1. Differences in available, domesticable plant and animal species on continents. 2. Barriers to influence, diffusion, and migration within continents. 3. Isolation between continents. And 4. Differences in area and population on continents. So, environmental and geographical reasons. Now, that's pretty straightforward, right? Let's zoom into difference number 2, which for some reason is the only one that everybody talks about, even though the other differences are pretty important too, and he spends plenty of time talking about them. So number 2, The complicated idea of barriers to diffusion is introduced by Jared Diamond with the simple idea of continental orientation, i.e., if a continent is oriented north to south or west to east. There's nothing inherently magical about that, and Diamond doesn't argue there is. Instead, it is because localities distributed east and west of each other at the same latitude share exactly the same day length and its seasonal variations. To a lesser degree, they also tend to share similar diseases, regimes of temperature and rainfall, and habitats or biomes, types of vegetation. Because it is a difficult, prolonged process to domesticate plants and animals, it's really beneficial to copy your neighbor's homework. For example, crops domesticated in the prehistoric Fertile Crescent were spread through diffusion to other societies in Europe, Asia, and North Africa too. They didn't get to South Africa, and they didn't get to the New World. Here's what he says. South Africa's Mediterranean climate would have been ideal for Fertile Crescent crops and animals, but the 2,000 miles of tropical conditions between Ethiopia and South Africa posed an insuperable barrier. Instead, African agriculture south of the Sahara was launched by the domestication of wild plants such as sorghum and African yams, indigenous to the Sahel zone and to tropical West Africa, and adapted to the warm temperatures, summer rains, and relatively constant day lengths of those low latitudes. Similarly, the spread southward of Fertile Crescent domestic animals through Africa was stopped or slowed by climate and disease, especially by trypanosome diseases carried by tsetse flies. The horse never became established farther south than West Africa's kingdoms north of the equator. The advance of cattle, sheep, and goats halted for 2,000 years at the northern edge of the Serengeti Plains, while new types of human economies and livestock breeds were being developed. Not until the period of 81 to 200, some 8,000 years after livestock were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, did cattle, sheep, and goats finally reach South Africa. A similar story, of course, can be found across the Atlantic. Highland Mexico and the Andes would similarly have been suitable for many of each other's crops and domestic animals. A few crops, notably Mexican corn, did indeed spread to the other region in the pre-Columbian era, but other crops and domestic animals failed to spread between Mesoamerica and South America. So while Europe could leapfrog the major, painstaking advances made by other societies, other continents had to start from scratch. Now again, this is just one part of the explanation for the environmental differences. He's got another chapter, for example, on how other continents simply had fewer contenders for domestication. The Native Americans of the Great Plains picked up horse riding just fine. But before the Spaniards brought horses across the Atlantic, there were no horses to ride, since North American horses went extinct 10,000 years ago. One possible reason is humans. Diamond doesn't make this specific argument about horses, but he does point out it's very possible we humans wiped out most of the megafauna of America, Australia, and other new continents when we first arrived thousands of years ago. On the other hand, most big mammals of Africa and Eurasia survived into modern times because they had co-evolved with proto-humans for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. They thereby enjoyed ample time to evolve a fear of humans, as our ancestors' initially poor hunting skills slowly improved. So, to summarize, because of those advantages, Eurasians developed larger food surpluses and storage, more large sedentary states, and greater technology. From those root causes came the proximate causes of Eurasian conquest of other continents. The titular guns, germs, and steel, as well as, horses, political organization, writing, and ocean-going ships. Now, obviously, no argument is perfect, but I think Guns, Germs, and Steel has a pretty strong thesis. There's some mistakes, of course there's always going to be nitpicks to be made, we're going to discover new things about archaeology that twist some of the arguments he makes over time, but I think the fundamental thesis is pretty strong. So, what's the issue? Let's first look at Cynical Historian's video on Guns, Germs, and Steel. African history disproves Guns, Germs, and Steel. Now, Cynical Historian and I, we have some beef, believe it or not. Back a few years ago, he called me a dumbass and said I was just rotting for the death of millions because I said Las Vegas was constructed in an inhospitable desert and is at risk of danger from climate change. I have slowly been biding my time for the past 3 years until I can make a video debunking Cynical Historian in the court of public opinion. When he blocked me on Twitter for saying he shouldn't flee the country, my resolve for vengeance only doubled. No, okay, but in all seriousness, this is the worst Cynical Historian video. His other videos are good, this one's pretty bad. This video has 620,000 views somehow. Unfortunately, his newer videos, which he puts more effort into, get many fewer views, which shows how history YouTube has changed dramatically, maybe for the worse. He explains Jared Diamond's premise a bit, then he says,
"Sounds pretty good, right? But the devil is in the details." To explain why Africa couldn't develop alongside Eurasia, he relies on a theory of continental axes. As you can see here, the Americas and Africa have a north-south axis, whereas Eurasia has an east-west one. This supposedly allowed crops to be more easily transposed throughout Eurasia, since they didn't have to adapt to more northerly or southerly climates.
Yeah, you can tell that Cynical Historian did not actually read this book, or if he did, he just skimmed it or something. Diamond does not say that the orientation of the continents, as I said before, is some magical property that prevents the diffusion of crops. Instead, it is shorthand for climate variation across continents. He doesn't make an absolute argument here. It's just a shorthand. Next, Cynical Historian says,
"The problem is that Diamond appears to not understand domestication nor the inherent problems of that map. Considering Diamond is a professor of geography, he should have noted that the Mercator projection does a giant disservice to Africa, which his second to last chapter is completely devoted to. The standard map that we all see wasn't designed to make the continents comparable sizes. It was meant to keep latitudinal lines straight for easier navigation. This has had an adverse effect of making areas closer to the equator appear immensely smaller than they really are. Africa is the worst affected by this. It is the second biggest continent after Asia, yet Europe somehow looks similarly sized. The projection is not some artifact of imperialism, as some people like to claim, but the downsizing of Africa in much of the world's minds is nonetheless the result of this nautically oriented map, and it appears to have affected Diamond as well. This axis theory is fundamental to his analysis of Africa, despite Eurasia having the same north-south axis as Africa. The difference from Africa's north-south distance and its east-west distance is only 8%. Seriously, 5,000 miles one way, 4,600 the other. You can't get more arbitrary than these lines on a map.
Again, I don't think Cynical Historian actually read this book. This response is completely nonsensical. It doesn't even address Jared Diamond's argument. It does not matter that Africa is really wide. For this review, Cynical Historian allegedly read 8 Eurocentric Historians, which has a couple chapters on Jared Diamond. This is what that book, which Cynical Historian apparently read, literally says on page 154. Diamond is not talking about axes at all. He is making a rather subtle argument about the climatic advantages that, in his view, mid-latitude regions have over tropical regions. The world's largest continuous zone of temperate climates, those that supposedly are neither too hot nor too cold, neither tropical nor subarctic, lies in a belt stretching across Eurasia, from Europe in the west to Japan in the east. But apparently Cynical Historian skimmed this book too. Again, it does not matter how wide Africa is. What matters is how easily domesticated crops and animals can be transferred from northern Africa to southern Africa. Judging from how history went, the answer is not very easily. For example, domesticated donkeys, a very useful animal, have been in northern Africa for thousands of years. It took them a long time to spread from northern Africa south of the Sahara. While some domesticated animals reached southern Africa, the donkey didn't. At least not until Europeans got there first. Now you might say, who cares about donkeys? Well, what about horses? Because horses didn't reach South Africa either until Europeans brought them there. You know, when they started conquering South Africa. It seems to be the case, as this article claims, that the oldest evidence for domesticated animals in southern Africa is generally accepted to be around 2000 before present. For comparison, that's about the same time as the Roman and Han empires, so about 10,000 years behind schedule. And why is that? Well, maybe it's got something to do with the Sahara Desert, or the Congo rainforest, or dangerous diseases that wipe out large land mammals. All things that Diamond specifically talks about in Guns, Germs, and Steel. So it's not just, this continent is taller than it is wide, it's the actual geography and environment of the continent. Here's what Cynical Historian says next.
Sub-Saharan Africa is not some wasteland that couldn't support these animals and crops. In fact, much of the domesticated products that supposedly helped Europe become dominant were to be found in Africa centuries prior to European invasions, along with plenty of their own. Europeans were able to bring their crops to Africa without much need for extra domestication. Colonial holdings in Africa often produced a good chunk of the grain for their empires as a whole. Africa is geographically diverse enough to support everything Europe had.
Jared Diamond literally argues that South Africa would be a great place for fertile crescent crops. It's just the issue of getting them there. He also doesn't argue that Africa didn't have its own crops. In the chapter that Cynical Historian supposedly read, Diamond says this: when Europeans reached sub-Saharan Africa in the 1400s, Africans were growing 5 sets of crops, each of them laden with significance for African history. The issue Diamond presents is that the diversity of climates in Africa prevented those sets of crops from being grown across Africa. For example, he says, even if fertile crescent crops adapted to winter rain could somehow have crossed the Sahara, they would have been difficult to grow in the summer rain Sahel zone. Likewise, he points out this about the Bantu migration into South Africa. It's not that the Cape of Good Hope itself is too dry for agriculture. It is, after all, the breadbasket of modern South Africa. Instead, the Cape has a Mediterranean climate of winter rains, in which the Bantu summer rain crops do not grow. To summarize that, hence, crops and animals domesticated or acquired in one part of Africa had great difficulty in moving to other parts. Plus, as Diamond writes on page 399, a second factor is a corresponding, though less extreme, disparity between sub-Saharan Africa and Eurasia in domesticable plants. The Sahel, Ethiopia, and West Africa did yield indigenous crops, but many fewer varieties than grew in Eurasia. Because of the limited variety of wild starting material suitable for plant domestication, even Africa's earliest agriculture may have begun several thousand years later than that of the Fertile Crescent. He talks about animal domestication too, but we already brought that up. The issue of cultural diffusion also influences, inevitably, technology. Pottery recorded in the Sudan and Sahara around 8000 BC did not reach the Cape until about 81. Although writing developed in Egypt by 3000 BC and spread in an alphabetized form to the Nubian kingdom of Meroe, and although alphabetic writing reached Ethiopia, possibly from Arabia, writing did not arise independently in the rest of Africa, where it was instead brought in from the outside by Arabs and Europeans. So, clearly the argument is much more complex than Cynical Historian realized. Anyways, he says this:
it is incorrect to claim that Africa couldn't domesticate enough species to compete. Not only could they, but they did.
See, this is the kind of boring, meaningless slop that characterizes so much of the criticism of Guns, Germs, and Steel. What does that quote even mean? Yeah, they did compete, and they lost. What does that even mean?
Diamond seems to acknowledge this by saying Africa's diverse peoples resulted from its diverse geography and its long prehistory. But he spends the rest of that chapter saying the difference was due to accidents of geography and biogeography, in particular to Africa's different areas, axes, and suites of wild plant and animal species. By reverting to that axis theory, he speaks of Africa as though it was some isolated entity prior to European conquest, which is definitely false.
No, Jared Diamond does not talk about Africa as though all of Africa was isolated. He literally talks in detail about the influences of the Middle East and Austronesians on Africa. The rest of the world had very little influence on Southern Africa, though. We can look at a map of African languages or religions and see the obvious evidence of this fact.
As James Blount, himself a geographer like Diamond, said of this axis theory, geography is important, but not that important. While the Sahara acts as a massive barrier even today, it was not something that couldn't be overcome. Romans explored into sub-Saharan Africa in the 1st century BC. Turks and Arabs were trading in African slaves as early as the 7th century AD. The Indian Ocean was interconnected by trade dating back to at least the Bronze Age, and trade caravans across the Sahara were recorded in ancient Egyptian records. In short, sub-Saharan Africa was connected by trade. In East Africa's case, far more so than Europe. So, isolation is not a sufficient answer.
Cynical Historian accuses people of treating Africa like a single country in this video, but he is literally doing the same thing. Yes, the outside world had contact across the Sahara, hence why there were Muslim kingdoms in the Sahel and East Africa. There was a Christian kingdom in Ethiopia. But that is not Jared Diamond's argument. He is arguing that it is difficult to transfer crops across the diverse regions and climates of Africa, and that some areas where certain types of crops would be great, specifically South Africa, were isolated. This is an obvious fact. Otherwise, those crops would have been grown there before Europeans got there. What other explanation is there for the fact that horses were brought by the Dutch?
So it doesn't make sense when Diamond says, Europeans entering Africa enjoyed the triple advantage of guns and other technology, widespread literacy, and the political organization necessary to sustain expensive programs of exploration and conquest. Clearly there was an advantage, but Africa had all of those things in certain places, and were often comparable to Europe.
Yet notice how Cynical Historian has to say certain places, and the unmeasurable value often comparable. You know what, I'm going to challenge Cynical Historian. Africa was actually rarely comparable to Europe in terms of guns, technology, widespread literacy, and the political organization necessary to sustain expensive programs of exploration and conquest. Here is the ultimate measure to settle this debate. Did Europe conquer Africa, or did Africa conquer Europe? Now, of course, there's one exception, which is Carthage, which is all the way in North Africa, and their civilization came from the Middle East, and Rome defeated them, so don't do a nitpick there. Diamond's obviously not talking about North Africa, considering the fact the first sentence of this paragraph that Cynical Historian takes an issue with is, the proximate reasons behind the outcome of Africa's collision with Europe are clear. So he's talking about sub-Saharan Africa, which unfortunately had even more weaknesses than Northern Africa. Otherwise, he'd be talking about Rome sacking Carthage or Alexander capturing Egypt, and not modern colonialism, wouldn't he? I guess he should have been more specific. So -1 point for Jared Diamond, but then Cynical Historian says this.
As far afield as the Mali and Songhai empires in West Africa, a grand civilization developed as part of the trans-Saharan trade. As one historian says, from the north, West Africa received brass and copper, cloth and spices, manufactured goods and horses, and Saharan salt, and in return, it exported gold, slaves, skins and leather, and ivory. Timbuktu became legendary for literally paying gold weight for weight with salt shipments. Further south was the Kingdom of Benin, which at the time had one of the largest planned cities in history, laid out in a fractal design with wide thoroughfares, underground drainage, and street lighting in the 15th century. As one visitor described it, Great Benin.
Yet this is all fine and good, and I think people should learn more about West Africa, but despite all of this cheerleading, the Europeans built forts on the shores of West Africa, not the other way around, and it was Britain and France that conquered those regions, not the other way around. That is a much more important measure of power than simply having gold or city planning. By the way, the Indus Valley civilization probably had planned cities about 3,000 years before Great Benin. Now, I'm not saying West African civilizations aren't cool. I'm saying let's keep some perspective in mind. Otherwise, you have no frame of reference to digest the fact that Europe conquered West Africa. It would just come out of the blue. You wouldn't even understand it. Here's what Cynical Historian says next.
This speaks to a couple key problems with Guns, Germs, and Steel. Specifically, his neglect of contingency and his tendency to view societies as holistic entities. Honestly, it's pretty weird to try answering why the West is strong by analyzing continents as a whole. Africa, let alone any other continent, is a huge and diverse place. There's more genetic diversity in the human population of Africa than all other continents combined. When people say, "I'm traveling to Africa," that would be the same as saying, "I'm traveling to Asia." Like, what does that even mean? But for some reason, we all treat Africa as a singular country when it's an entire continent.
Yeah, Cynical Historian literally just did that. Jared Diamond spends much of his chapter on Africa talking about how culturally and geographically diverse Africa is. That's a major part of his argument, actually. Cynical Historian's response to that is to just list a bunch of advanced African civilizations, all of which are in one specific region of the continent. Next, Cynical Historian says this bizarre quote.
He gets especially bad with his epilogue, where he basically says China was too tyrannical to become a world power. That's called Oriental despotism, which is the racist idea Asians and Northern Africans needed to control water in their countries, called hydraulic societies, so they naturally resort to tyrannical rule. Suffice it to say, Diamond has been nailed pretty badly for that idea.
Huh? Okay, first, saying tyrannical rule is not rooted in any genetic factor, but instead environmental conditions is not racist. That is literally the opposite of racism. It's rejecting inherent racial factors. Second, Jared Diamond does not make this argument at all in his book. This is a complete hallucination. I'm honestly wondering what other Cynical Historian videos made such obvious mistakes. I think he just didn't really try on this video, which is unfortunate. I think he just skimmed 8 Eurocentric historians, which does randomly accuse Diamond of believing in Oriental despotism on page 169, because he points out China's relatively centralized government caused some disadvantages, which is a fact. Here's what Jared Diamond says, by the way. He brings up Zhang He's Treasure Fleet Voyage, which, in case you don't know, was a gigantic effort by the Chinese government to promote contact and diplomacy with the rest of Asia and parts of the Middle East. India, too. Jared Diamond then points out that the strong central Chinese government changed its policy, cracked down on foreign expeditions and foreign contact, and entered a period of isolation, pretty much the opposite of Western European kingdoms that promoted contact abroad. This is historically undeniable. This is just what happened. But why did they do that? Now, Jared Diamond doesn't even approach anything close to Oriental despotism or hydraulic tyranny. He says this: they were then suspended as a result of a typical aberration of local politics that could happen anywhere in the world. A power struggle between two factions at the Chinese court, the eunuchs and their opponents. The former faction had been identified with sending and captaining the fleets. Hence, when the latter faction gained the upper hand in a power struggle, it stopped sending fleets, eventually dismantled the shipyards, and forbade ocean-going shipping. The episode is reminiscent of the legislation that strangled development of public electric lighting in London in the 1880s, the isolationism of the United States between the First and Second World Wars, and any number of backward steps in any number of countries, all motivated by local political issues. But in China, there was a difference, because the entire region was politically unified. Now, this is an oversimplified explanation, but it is basically true, and obviously, it's not racist. He points out that similar things happened elsewhere. Not in Asia, in Europe. He mentions London as an example. Imagine if Portugal decided to cancel all foreign expeditions in the 1480s. All the traders and explorers could just go right next door to Spain. That wasn't an option in medieval China. Maybe Cynical Historian got confused and started yapping about racism because Diamond talks about rivers later on in the epilogue as an explanation for why China might have been more unified than Europe. He says, China's heartland is bound together from east to west by two long, navigable river systems in rich alluvial valleys, the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, and it is joined from north to south by relatively easy connections between these two river systems, eventually linked by canals. As a result, China very early became dominated by two huge geographic core areas of high productivity, themselves only weakly separated from each other and eventually fused into a single core. Now, maybe that argument isn't completely correct, maybe there's some nitpicks you can poke in it, but I think it's okay. And you know what, Cynical Historian, if you're watching this video, which I doubt, I challenge you to find where specifically Jared Diamond makes a racist argument in this section of the book or anywhere else in the book, or why the idea that the challenges of river management pushes societies towards strong, central forms of government is racist. Not just used by racists to condemn Asian civilizations, which might be true, but actually in and of itself racist. Anyways, here's what Cynical Historian says in his conclusion.
Whatever made the West strong, it wasn't the continental axis of Africa. The question of Western hegemony is still open to debate.
I honestly think that if you're gonna throw out the environmental explanation for Western prosperity, you're gonna have to present another theory. Because in a vacuum, the natural, inevitable conclusion that people will make is that Western success is cultural or genetic. So what is it? Is it just an accident that Spain conquered Mexico and not the other way around? Well, the book that Cynical Historian apparently read, 8 Eurocentric Historians, makes the argument on page 161 that it's because indigenous people got to America relatively late in human history, so their whole schedule was delayed, i.e., geographical causes. Likewise, the author presents the argument on page 2 that Europe specifically had the advantage of having greater access to vulnerable America than other parts of Eurasia. Now, I'm not sure if this is completely viable, there's some merit to it, but at least it's some theory to go on. While it seems to me that Cynical Historian didn't even read Guns, Germs, and Steel, I'll give credit to another YouTube channel for going in detail. Everyone's favorite Chechen gulag escapee, BadEmpanada. In this video, which has 150,000 views, BadEmpanada does a good job pointing out how Jared Diamond makes a bunch of serious historical mistakes in his chapter on the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Rather than playing his hour-long video, I'll just summarize. Jared Diamond relies too much on the conquistadors' own exaggerated tales of their own success. Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, was not defeated in battle, as Diamond wrongly says, but instead basically kidnapped. Diamond forgets about all the useful indigenous allies that helped Spain beat the Aztec and Inca emperors too. Now, he does explain that maybe they sided with Spain because the advantages that they brought to America, but it doesn't really talk about them much. Modern historians today now make sure to include indigenous allies when talking about this history. BadEmpanada points out 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest by Matthew Restall as a better book on that subject, which is true. I'd like to add something that BadEmpanada missed, which is that the Inca quickly began to adopt European technology and did not do a terrible job prolonging the fight. There's another good book that I want to recommend called Thundersticks, which talks about how native North Americans adopted firearm weapons pretty effectively. But you know what? Obviously, Spain conquered Central America and the Andes, so Jared Diamond's mistake of hand-waving away Spain's native allies does not break his thesis, which is the important part of the book that people are going to take away. Here's where I disagree with BadEmpanada.
So, was technology useful to the Spanish conquest? Yeah, sure. As it would be in any military venture. Was it the reason, as Diamond asserts? Absolutely not. Not even close. There was a complex array of factors, chief among them alliances with native polities and a whole lot of dumb luck. Horses and steel swords are very far down the list. But Diamond wanted to reduce it so simply to military technology, and so he straight up invented a series of battles where it won the day all by itself. Once guns got better and more common further down the line, technology certainly did become a lot more decisive, but colonialism of the Americas began long beforehand, so that's hardly enough to explain it.
Yeah, this is just a bad response. Jared Diamond does get historical facts wrong, that's true, but here's a key historical fact he doesn't get wrong. The Spaniards were in America, and not the other way around. They needed technology to get there, didn't they? The Inca did not invent grand, advanced sailing technology that could cross the Atlantic. Otherwise, they would have sailed to Spain and intervened in Spain's own civil wars, wouldn't they? Also, while luck is an okay explanation for like one victory, you're really stretching it when looking at the big picture. Maybe Pizarro got lucky. Maybe Cortez also got lucky. But luck is just not enough to explain all the victories over literally hundreds of years of European powers over Americans and Africans and Pacific Islanders. Luck cannot explain why they speak Spanish from San Francisco all the way down to Buenos Aires, while they don't speak Nahuatl in Madrid. Well, I suppose environmental circumstances can count as luck, but you know what I mean. It's not that the Inca sent a bunch of naval fleets out to Europe that got lost and crashed before they could kidnap Emperor Charles V. That just didn't happen. Here's probably the worst part of the Bad Empanada video.
Anyway, next he moves on from military technology. How did Atahualpa come to be at Cajamarca? Atahualpa and his army came to be at Cajamarca because they had just won decisive battles in a civil war that left the Incas divided and vulnerable. Pizarro quickly appreciated those divisions and exploited them. The reason for the civil war was that an epidemic of smallpox, spreading overland among South American Indians after its arrival with Spanish settlers in Panama and Colombia, had killed the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and most of his court around 1526, and then immediately killed his designated heir, Ninankayuchi. Those deaths precipitated a contest for the throne between Atahualpa and his half-brother Huascar. If it had not been for the epidemic, the Spaniards would have faced a united empire. Atahualpa's presence at Cajamarca thus highlights one of the key factors in world history: diseases transmitted to people lacking immunity by invading people with considerable immunity. It is widely theorized that Huayna Capac died from smallpox. Assuming that he did, it was total chance. He just as easily might not have contracted smallpox and survived. Using the death of one specific person as an illustrative example of the role that disease played is tenuous at best. This was just another one of the perfect storm of lucky coincidences that benefited Pizarro. He just as easily might not have died from the epidemic, and what then?
Huh? This counter-argument is legitimately nonsense. It doesn't make any sense, because the Spaniards brought the smallpox. Plus, it's not just, it's like having a random chance that your enemy just dies before you fight him. That's a pretty good advantage to have, isn't it? Plus, it's not just the death of one person that Bad Empanada says. The Jared Diamond quote he literally has on the screen lists multiple people: Huayna Capac and most of his court, and then his designated heir, Inancahuchi. Literally the next paragraph talks about how Eurasian diseases wiped out millions of people throughout the world. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, and other infectious diseases endemic in Europe played a decisive role in European conquests by decimating many peoples on other continents. Throughout the Americas, diseases introduced with Europeans spread from tribe to tribe far in advance of the Europeans themselves, killing an estimated 95% of the pre-Columbian Native American population. This isn't some biased thing that Jared Diamond gets wrong, since 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, the book that Bad Empanada recommends, makes the same argument on page 141. So yes, I guess it's lucky that the Spaniards brought the deadlier diseases, but it is not random coincidence. It is because the Spaniards came from a continent with many more dense cities where lethal diseases had a chance to spring up, spread, and gift the population immunity. You can argue the specific case of any specific person dying from smallpox is a game of chance, but Jared Diamond didn't do that in the quote. Bad Empanada just imagined that. Anyways, Bad Empanada points out some more factual mistakes that Jared Diamond makes, summarizes his criticisms, then says,
Myself, well, I would argue that the course of history was not determined by anything in particular, but rather countless different events, all with their own numerous complexities and nuances, that all ended up influencing one another in an endless chain of action until we got to where we are today. Not as tidy and compelling as a nice, simple pattern that explains everything, but also impossible to poke holes in, while pattern-seeking theories of history are just full of them. And I really think that the preoccupation with searching for some broad historical pattern is a very human thing. We want to be able to neatly explain everything. We want to feel like there's some sort of rhyme and reason to everything, but sometimes there just isn't, and you're completely free to believe otherwise. I can't prove you wrong, you can't prove me wrong. All that I can do is point out the flaws in such beliefs, tell you where they come from, and where they might lead.
Okay, so here we have the Bad Empanada theory of history, where history is just caused by countless different events, all with their own numerous complexities and nuances. Except no, that's what history is. What are the causes of those events? There's just no theoretical possible root to anything. Even Marx had his material basis, his base, and the superstructure built upon it. But I guess apparently it's just a bizarre coincidence that Europeans colonized so much of the world. It's just something that happened. From Canada all the way to Africa to Australia, it's just random chance. Why? BadEmpanada doesn't know. Probably just a random coincidence. Here's what 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, which BadEmpanada cites, says. This trilogy of factors, disease, native disunity, and Spanish steel, goes most of the way toward explaining the conquest's outcome. See, that's something. Things have causes and effects, and those causes and effects can be categorized. Guns, Germs, and Steel doesn't have a singular, simple explanation. It has lots of explanations, which is why it's 500 pages. Those explanations are all collectively rooted in the environment and geography that human societies found themselves in. Neither Cynical Historian nor BadEmpanada offered an alternative, even when their sources did. If you don't agree with environmental or geographical explanations, what else is there? A cultural or genetic explanation? Well, neither believe in that, so they're left with no viable theory of anything, and we, the audience, are left with nothing. I'll end the video by pointing out that historians love to nitpick guns, germs, and steel, which is good. That's what we're supposed to do. But it is a failure of historians, ultimately, that non-historians keep writing the major popular works of history. That's part of the reason why I, a humble holder of a master's in history, made this channel in the first place. I think the thesis of Guns, Germs, and Steel is strong. Even though he makes mistakes, a historian wouldn't. The answer is for a historian to take a crack at it. Anyways, that's enough for today. Like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow to get early access to future videos for just $1 a month, like the generous people on screen now. Thank you very much, and adios.